Hi and welcome to the 11th episode of Wales.Pol. Today I am joined by Shavanah Taj, who is the National Officer for Wales and the South West for PCS, the trade union, and also the Vice President of the TUC for Wales. Thanks for joining us, Shavanah.
Thank you, Harriet.
I'm just wondering for our listeners and viewers, if you could tell us a bit about you, your work in the trade unions and how you got involved.
So I was recruited through something called the TUC Organising Academy. And the purpose that it was actually set up was, in the late 90s, was because the trade union movement accepted and actually acknowledged that they had a problem as far as the representation of trade unionists was concerned. People who work for the union, people who were organisers, etc. And they knew that they needed to find ways and means of attracting a broader group of people, more younger people, people from all types of backgrounds, because ultimately, we always say in the trade union movement, like recruits like.
Thanks, Shav. I think lots of people my age and lots of people that I know who would consider themselves kind of like leftists or socially liberal have fantastic politics when it comes to elections and movements. But in terms of their representation and their rights in the workplace, not a lot of them are actually involved in trade unions, which for me is like a really hard thing to try and have a conversation about and try and understand. So I'm wondering if you could explain to them, for those who don't know, like what the basic function of a trade union is.
Okay, so the basic function of a trade union is very, very simple actually, because when you are in work, when you have a problem in work, there is only one place for you to go to if there is no union, and that's HR. HR are paid by the employer. They are not independent. All they are there ultimately to do, in most cases, is to protect the interests of the employer and to make sure that they are doing things above the board. But, as is the case for most things in life, you do need to have independent advice and to know that somebody else can come and advocate and mediate and negotiate on your behalf, but not just on your behalf, but it's a structure that allows the average worker to take power away from the employer solely, which is where it lies if there is no unions, and to protect you as a worker.
I really like that bit you mentioned around building power, because I imagine lots of people my age, when they go to work, when they leave university and go into the workforce, it's just standard. The way things are have always been the way they are, I imagine, in people's minds. So then getting involved in a trade union offers people a different avenue, doesn't it, to try and like express themselves at work and like you said, build power with their colleagues. So I've got a couple of friends that have come to me recently actually saying they're having difficulty in work and have like shared various stories with me, and they come to me for advice, bless them, and I'm like, I'm not an industrial officer, like I couldn't tell you how to do this, but like end up trying to like help someone. And the idea of like finding a recognition agreement or building a recognition agreement, how would you suggest that someone would go about that?
So I would say to people, if you can get an employer to voluntarily recognise your union, that is probably the nicest and easiest option. But it all depends on which industry you're talking about. Because if you work in the public sector in Wales, for example, the public sector in Wales, because of the fact that we have a Labour government, we have a Welsh Labour government in power, and that is very friendly to unions. We have a really good partnership model that we operate on, and you're encouraged, you know, through the First Minister onwards to join the union, right? And most of our elected representatives themselves are members of a trade union, despite being politicians and despite being people in power themselves and being in those positions. So you can go down that route. But ultimately, if you are working in Amazon, for example, it's going to be a lot harder, right? Yeah. And lots of people would have seen all the documentaries on the telly. You know, there's been that story recently, for example, in Sports Direct, where, you know, there was a woman that gave birth in the toilets, and she came back to do her job, having given birth literally not so long ago. You know, and that just shows you the level of exploitation that's out there. Now, if an employer doesn't want to recognise you, you've then got to build from the beginning. And what you need by law at the moment, and under the legislation that we currently have, and trade union laws in this country are probably, one of the worst, I would say, across the world. Definitely in comparison to other parts of Europe, where, I think maybe like the States is, the USA has probably got, worse trade union legislation. But nonetheless, so you would need to have at least 50% plus one, is the official word, of people who are saying that, the entire workforce that say, we want a union in the first place. So there is a long process for that. So you put an application into something called the Central Arbitration Committee, etc., etc. But there are other ways and means as well, and that is using your leverage. So looking at where the power lies. So, have you got a board of trustees, for example? Is anyone on that board that is friendly to unions or to equality, for example? Do they believe in diversity? What are they saying in the media? What other interests do they have? So you've got to work all that through and map out and really analyze that data and build up a picture of what you're playing with, really. Where are the power dynamics? Who's responsible here? Where's the soft power? Where's the other dynamics? And how does that interplay? And once you've mapped that out, you may actually be in a position where you think that you need to build up the union to a certain point and you've got to go through the formal legal routes. But actually, through using your community networks and your wider networks, you may be in a position where you might, apply a media strategy, a political strategy, talk to other people in your community.
Imagine that you're someone that's not really had a union education or an understanding, and they say, why would I join a trade union? I'm wondering, what are some of the wins that we could share with people to try and explain what the union could or couldn't do? Yeah.
So you can look at lots of, there's loads of different examples, and, many people refer back to previous struggles, particularly in Wales. We've got a rich history as far as industrial disputes and campaigns are concerned. But one of the ones that was quite interesting a couple of years ago now, we had a dispute at the National Museum of Wales, and basically the employers granting, the amount of money funding that they get from government had been cut. Every single sector was being told that you've got to do more with less. Right? So the employer had, they thought, well, where can we possibly make some cuts, right? And as is often the case, they decided that they were going to go after the lowest paid. And the lowest paid, basically, the dispute was over weekend working, right? So if you worked a weekend, you got additional pay, etc., etc. That additional pay was also pensionable, right? So they basically came for them, and the union, the dispute ran for about 2.5 years. We went back and forward, we lobbied the government, we entered into negotiations and mediation through ACAS, but the members decided that enough was enough, and it was the assembly elections at the time. But ultimately, this was about the workers, right? And it goes back down to worker power, and it goes back down to strategic organising, campaigning, and it's got to be very, very organic, and people have got to feel ownership. The way they self-organised, they were organising through WhatsApp groups, they were meeting in a coffee shop and stuff on a weekly basis. And when the dispute actually started, they literally were running their whole thing like machinery. The operation was unbelievable. They were organising their own picket lines, and they were looking after each other's mental health and well-being as well, because, when you're on strike, and they were on strike for a significant amount of time, it can be really disheartening, and it's really, really hard, But what made a difference was, I think, that they knew this was make or break. And but what they also knew was that the union was there for them. We did win the dispute. I'm really glad to say we won the dispute. In fact, we ended up with a lot more than we thought that we were going to end up with. And what was great about it is that we are now in a position with the employer where they value the union's opinion. So the shift and balance of power has just like changed, you know? That in itself is a real learning curve for them.
Yeah. Do you know, I remember when I was in university, right, I was in Edinburgh, and one of my good friends, Gordon, shout out to Gordon, told me one day, right, there's a group of people in Edinburgh Museum going on strike and we need to go and support them. So I went over to Gordon's house and I made this big banner, like a massive banner that said, pay your staff, right, out of gaffer tape and a bed sheet. And we went into the National Museum of Scotland, and we went in with loads of tin pans, and we did banner drops from the sides of the museum, and we were like bashing things, being like, do you know that the employer is not paying the staff here? My friend Mike got up with a megaphone and like stood on one of these wee statues. And it was a really amazing experience because we could do that as solidarity on behalf of the staff. The staff weren't going to do that because they were picketing, but we could go in and disrupt the space. Anyway, it was only until later that I found out that it was a PCS, it was a weekend working allowance.
It was the same dispute.
Yeah, it was this very dispute.
The difference was, you see, the disputes had been running about the same time. The difference with their dispute was that their First Minister settled. And because we had the assembly elections at the time, it was more difficult for, I guess, to do that straight away. But what we did get was a commitment to say that, you know, if we are the ones who are, you know, running and we are leading the assembly again, we will resolve the dispute. And we had the same from Plaid as well. So this is where I think that it's really, really important. And as you say, the disruption and disruptive organising and supporting and showing solidarity in that way is so important. And sometimes I think that, you know, we can get, we start thinking that you only organise in a certain way, but actually, every single dispute is somewhat different, and you do need additional elements to come in at different points. Totally. You know, there is no fixed way of winning. Absolutely, anything can happen, and anything is possible. But the key thing in all of this is that as I going back, you know, with these workers, they knew that everyone was with them.
I'm wondering whether you can explain the new government legislation, the Social Partnership Act, and is it the Fair Work Commission?
Yeah, made some recommendations.
Yeah, okay. Can you talk me through some of that?
So the purpose of the Social Partnership Act is going to be, one, that we find ways and means of legislating to protect workers' rights, protecting workers' rights, for example, the living wage, but also that any employer that is currently in receipt of any government grant must recognise unions.
That's massive.
Right? So that's huge, right? So that means that unions have got to get access to the workers to be able to unionise and organise that workforce. That's going to be really interesting because it gives the automatic right to trade unions to grow in sectors that we may have not traditionally been able to cut through to, or in sectors where it's a lot more difficult to get into to actually unionise in the first place. So we will no longer have to unionise from the back door. We get to come through the front door. And also that, you know, when it comes to employers who are procuring work, you know, contracting services out, etc., that there's an ethical process for how they procure that work and to make sure that people get paid as a minimum the living wage, you know, and their health and safety is protected. So all of those things basically come into play. And I think it's going to be really interesting. But our key fundamental point in all of this has been that workers' rights, policies, procedures, all of these things, the Fair Work Commission's recommendations, which we were fully in support of because the recommendations that they came up with were very much in tune and in line with what we were looking for as well. So that in itself was very interesting. And I think it made a difference because some of the individuals that were involved in the group that was commissioned to do that work were trade unionists themselves. So they understood the issues, right? And as far as ultimately this is about creating an equal level playing field as well. This is about protecting our equalities duties and making sure that employers aren't just telling us every year, this is what my data looks like as far as black staff are concerned, as far as young workers are concerned, but all of that has to, be deeply embedded. But for us, it was really important to have enforcement because without enforcement, nothing means anything. So for us, the enforcement element is 100% totally crucial because otherwise we keep going around in circles, creating lots of little disputes here and there, starting fires. But actually, if there is a mechanism and a structure within government that applies that enforcement, then it's a game changer.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Are there talks similarly in Scotland?
Yes.
And are they? Okay.
So there are talks similarly in Scotland, but I don't think that they've got to the legislative element of it just yet. And it's kind of, a lot of it is voluntary and in partnership, etc. But for us, this is going to mean that it's going to be in legislation, which means regardless of what change of government, it's going to be harder to change things because it's going to be embedded in law.
And it's like quite a distinct thing for Wales to be doing at the moment. And
it's
like
the Welsh way,
Yeah.
Yeah, as we say, yeah.
It's really sweet. I want to throw a really controversial question at you, and only because I know you'll handle it well. And that is, someone said to me a couple of weeks ago, a leftist that we both know, a fantastic person, they said to me, trade unions, they're just tinkering at the edges of capitalism, right? And I was like, oh. And that, it's a negotiation between workers and the employer and it's not a revolutionary force, etc. I told you this would be a controversial question. I'm just wondering how we have the conversation about a radical trade union. And I don't mean necessarily like explicitly revolutionary trade union, but I mean in terms of how we kind of build that class consciousness into the trade unions rather than it just being a servicing kind of union. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we kind of navigate the servicing, organising and collective.
So going back to the Organising Academy, another element of the creation of the Organising Academy was that we were very conscious of the fact that we had spent a lot of time and resources on servicing members. And when we say servicing members, we literally mean that if somebody has a problem at work, that somebody will represent them on a one-to-one basis with the employer, if necessary at an employment tribunal, etc., etc. And you basically provide legal services for that individual. And it is absolutely right that that element continues because the fact of the matter is that sometimes you may need to take your employer to court, right?
Definitely,
because some bosses are bad, some they misbehave. So you need that element. But I definitely think that we need to sometimes be a bit more creative and a bit more open, being more open to digitalization and using new tools, alternative tools to organise the workplace, to give the opportunity to people to communicate with other workers, because there's a lot of people who work from home, for example, now, right?
Yeah.
It's actually, for a lot of people, they work in that way. It might be that you're a member of a union, but there is no union recognition, but you've joined the union. And now you want to be able to communicate with other people like yourself in a similar situation, or maybe somebody who works for the same company in a different place that's got union recognition, right? So we do need to be more radical, but but then define radical. Because the person who said this, I'd love to have that conversation with them on a one-to-one basis.
Yeah, you would.
Because I think sometimes people just like to sound like they're controversial and a little bit niche and stuff. And, it's like, yeah, I know quite a bit because I've read a couple of theories and stuff. But what's your lived experience? Where is this coming from? Because quite frankly, I'm sorry, but unless you've actually had a one-to-one conversation, or you've organised workers who are really, really scared, right? And they're really scared of being found out and losing their jobs. Or when you organise workers, when I've organised cleaners and security guards and places like the Tate Galleries. I remember like going in at like 5 a.m. to be able to engage with workers, and a lot of them were like South American women, okay? And they would literally, I would talk to them while they were on shift, while they were cleaning toilets. And I remember this one situation where they heard the supervisor come in and they literally slammed the door shut, closed the door. And I'm like, this is really strange. And they jumped to put the toilet seat down, jumped onto the toilet seat, and they grabbed me and put me on the toilet seat.
No.
We were standing there, and I'm thinking, what is going on here?
That's
because they
wild.
didn't want to get found out,
of
right?
course,
They did not want the employer to know that they were a member of a union already, but two, because of the fact that they were on like a 0-hour contract. And actually, officially, they weren't even on the list of the workers.
That is really helpful for us to try and understand how the trade unions are functioning in Wales at the moment. I'm wondering, just to finish this really beautifully, if you could inspire someone to join a trade union, what would be, say you had like a 10-minute conversation, or say 5-minute conversation with someone, what would be the things that you would say to them to encourage them to get involved, not just in a union, but in the movement?
So it's very important when you're talking to people that you listen. And we have this like a bit of a formula. So we say 70% listening, 30% talking. Because actually you need to hear what the person is thinking. So you need to ask more like leading questions, be interested in what they have to say, and listen to their story. And then if you feel it's appropriate, share your story, right? And find a connection with that person. But what I always say to people is, if you're tired of being treated and in a certain way, being mistreated, being pushed from pillar to post, and you're really frustrated, that means something is wrong, right? And if you think that the only way out is to literally leave, right? Then something is definitely wrong. But join a union because actually it is the only opportunity that you will ever get of tipping the balance, right? And it's about leveling up. That is what it's about. It is about having control and say collectively and being part of something that's much bigger than you, and knowing that when you fall, that there is somebody that will catch you and protect you and look after you, and you can do the same thing in return for them.
Oh, that's really lovely. A friend said to me, I've mentioned this to you before, a friend said to me, we were talking about a job role. And they said to me, people need to remember that it's not their job, that they are like caretakers of that job for the next generation.
Absolutely.
And the next person that comes along, we need to fight for their right to have the same standards, terms and conditions, and same job. And I thought that was really beautiful, to think of like labour and what you do and what you output into the world as something that is going to be passed on to someone coming after you. And you just reminded me of that, so thank you.
Thank you.
This has been really fun, Shavanah.